like me, you typically think of Ireland as a country of immigrants, beginning, I spell that with an E. However, in recent years, it has become a country of immigrants spelled with an I. So in the last decade, more than 200,000 Poles, for example, have migrated to Ireland, and I think in June of this last year, Ireland elected its first black mayor, an immigrant from Nigeria, an immigrant of only 7 years. That provoked a pretty extensive and sensitive debate in Ireland. We are very fortunate today to have one of the leading figures in Irish studies internationally as our speaker. Luke Gibbons was educated at University College in Galway. He received honors for both his bachelor's and his master's degree there. He also has a degree from the National University of Ireland and earned his PhD from Trinity College in Dublin. He taught at Dublin City College from 1981 to 2000, when we were able to bring him to the University of Notre Dame. He's held 2 posts, if you want to think of it in that way here. We initially hired him as a professor in the English department with the concurrent appointment in film, television, and theater. He's also a fellow of the Keogh Naughton Institute of Irish Studies. But in 2003, he was elevated to the Keogh Family Chair of Irish Studies here at the university. He has published widely, and in fact, I think it's safe to say he is one of the key individuals who has helped to create what we call Irish Studies today. His publications address film, culture, literature, literary theory, as well as politics. Just to give you a couple of hints, he published a book, Cinema in Ireland. He was the co-author, which was the first book on film in Ireland. He also co-edited The Theatre of Irish Cinema, a special issue of the Yale Journal of Criticism, which has been a very seminal work in the study of Irish film. A couple of his other important books, Edinburgh in Ireland, which looked at the conventional opposition of aesthetics and politics, Gaelic Gothic, which explored the anti-Catholicism and some of those dimensions, and also, just to mention one other, Transformations in Ireland, a book that looked at the question of Ireland's anomalous status as a first world country with a third world memory. It is my honor and privilege to be able to present to you Professor Luke Gibbons, who will be presenting a lecture on global Ireland, from Celtic Twilight to Celtic Tiger. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks very much, Greg, and thanks to the Keogh Institute and to the SNITE and to the Arts and Letters for this Saturday Scholar platform and forum. Above all, thanks to you for coming along at what would be regarded in Ireland as valuable drinking time. Your cause knows no bounds. And in fact, I am going to talk about migration and memory in relation to Ireland. But actually, tailgating recalls a story about the Irish guy who goes into a bar and orders 3 pints of Guinness. One for myself and one for Mickey and the other for Jack. So the barman says, "Give me a shout when they arrive." And Pat says, "They're not here." He says, "You want 3 pints? 2 for your friends, and they're not here." He said, "Yeah, they're in Australia." He says, so let me get this right. You want 3 pints, one for yourself and the other for your 2 friends in Australia. He said, yes. He said, you see, the night before they emigrated, we decided to go on a last bender. And we decided, in honour of the diaspora, that every time we'd go into a pub from now on, we'd raise a glass to each other. And that's why, he says, every time I go into a pub now, in honour of my departed friends, I always have 2 extra pints. And the barman said, okay, suit yourself, everyone to his own medicine. So things were going great until a few months later, Pat comes into the pub with a long face on him. 2 pints of Guinness, he says. The barman says, 2 pints? Are you sure it's not 3? No, he said, I'm off the drink for Lent. Just the 2. So, such is the devotion to memory and to migration that the Irish embody, I suppose. But I'm going to start with that actual sentence that opened my book 10 years ago, that Greg quoted, that Ireland is a first world country, but with a third world memory. And I opened my book, Transformations in Irish Culture, 10 years ago, without realising that in 10 years, in the intervening 10 years, the third world, or developing countries, would become more than a memory in Ireland and would become an actual lived and living presence in contemporary Ireland. So in 10 years, the memory has actually become a presence, albeit of a different kind, in contemporary Ireland. Of course, 10 years ago, when I wrote that in a book published by Notre Dame Press, I didn't realise I'd be teaching in Notre Dame either in 10 years' time, or indeed that I would be giving the Saturday Scholars talk, even less. But that is what transformations are about. So it's that kind of transition I want to address in the talk this morning. And Greg mentioned the rapid transformations that have taken place in Ireland in the last 10 years. In the last decade, Ireland has changed from being, quote, the sleepy economic backwater of Europe, as The Economist magazine described it, to become, in material terms, one of the most advanced countries in the world, being hailed variously, and these are quotes from The Economist and other magazines, as the showpiece or the test case or the shining light of globalisation. So Ireland has become this extraordinary success story in terms of what is perceived as globalisation. By the late 1990s, the growth rate in the Irish economy was the highest in Europe, rising to 3 times the European average. Unemployment, the permanent black spot in the Irish economy, also underwent a startling reversal, from a rate of 17%, 17, in 1987. And that's where Ireland began to labour under this almost third world description, that its unemployment rates were of a third world capacity. Hence the massive immigration from Ireland, even as late as the 1980s and early 1990s. But from a rate of 17% in 1987, unemployment had fallen to 4% by 1999. Says The Economist in 2004, quote, surely no country in the rich world has seen its image change so fast. And this raises the question about its image. What are then the images in question? The images that are changing. If Ireland and Irish identity during the literary revival, which took place 100 years ago, and that's often described as the Celtic Twilight, the massive upsurge in energy that gave rise to Yeats and Synge and O'Casey and Shaw and Wilde, and that whole kind of furnace that ignited the Irish cultural independence 100 years ago. if that whole kind of energy took place 100 years ago, giving rise to the Celtic Twilight, what then are the new images appropriate for the age of the Celtic tiger 100 years later? In a sense, we have to go back to what James Joyce called the smithy of the soul to forge new images of contemporary Ireland. We have to go back to the workshop to forge new images. Certainly the most dramatic change that has taken place in self-images of the nation is in the composition of the population itself. And Greg alluded to some of these. With foreign nationals, and that word itself is an important word, because there was a tendency in some of the Irish debates to refer to immigrants as non-nationals. But I would take issue with that term, because people who are non-nationals end up in Guantanamo Bay. And that phrase non-national is a very lethal word to use, as if someone has no country. So the word foreign nationals, I think, is a preferable word. But in any case, the population of foreign nationals in Ireland now is 14%, 1-4, as against 10% of the United States. So Ireland really has undergone this startling transformation in the last 10 years. Of these, and again, these figures are worth just alluding to again, it's reckoned that of this the whole workforce in Ireland in 1991, the entire workforce was 1,100,000. In the last 5 years, 250,000 Poles have come into Ireland alone. 250,000 Poles, 45,000 from Lithuania, 30,000 from Latvia, 60,000 from China, 28,000 to 30,000 from Nigeria, 5,000 from both Romania and the Philippines. And in all, there are 200 languages now registered in the official public sphere in Ireland, which is one of the monitors is the need for translation services in social welfare in the courts. Over 200 languages are now in the conversation Ireland is having with itself. So the impact of these developments, to say the least, has led to a whole series of debates in contemporary Irish culture and a recreation of the images that Ireland is now forging for itself. In a recent film by the Scottish novelist Irving Welsh, famous for his book Trainspotting, he has a recent film called Nuts, which is a scathing critique or a scathing look at Ireland in the age of the so-called Celtic tiger, the boom that has occurred in the Irish economy that has led to these developments. And at one dinner party scene, one of the characters remarks with a kind of casual certitude, as someone says, the kind of certitude that Irish people often have in pub conversations. Beware of that kind of certitude. But one of the characters says, how the Irish can't be racist. And then she says, how can we be? We are the original economic migrants. How can we be racist? We are the original migrants. To which another guest counters, in case the parallels with the past draw too close for comfort. She says, we contributed wherever we went, they don't. And I'm going to say a lot about that simple exchange. There's so much going on in that exchange. In this short exchange, we can see some of the ironies and evasions of history that have informed recent debates on immigration in the new multi-ethnic Ireland. On the one hand, there is the uncritical claim to high moral ground with respect to racism on account of Ireland's own colonial and diasporic or immigrant history, as if the experience of injustice or hardship in the past automatically prevented its perpetuation in the present. So there's this kind of bland statement that just because we experienced oppression in the past, we can't visit it upon others. Automatically, as it were. On the other hand, and this is going to be more the focus of my talk, on the other hand, there is the equally suspect hollowing out of history, emptying out of history, that denies any analogies at all between Ireland's past and the condition of immigrants in the Ireland of the Celtic Tiger. So I'm going to try and argue that, on the one hand, there's this blasé assumption that we can't be racist, that the Irish can't be racist, because we've been there and we've suffered that. I wish it were as easy as that. On the other hand, there's an equal knee-jerk reaction which says Ireland's past has nothing to do with it. That's all over and done with. The Irish are the same as everyone else. And if that is the case, then it bodes ill for immigrants in contemporary Ireland. So I'm going to argue that we need to chart some kind of ground or some space between those two oppositions. Starting with noting that there is indeed a sense in which Ireland's own history of uprooting and emigration should generate sympathy for the plight of the immigrant in Ireland today. But there is nothing automatic about this. So I'm going to argue that there is a sense in which Irish people should relate to this. But as we said, there is nothing, unfortunately, inevitable about this. In the first flush of economic success under the Celtic Tiger in the last 10 years, it may be that the last thing Irish people want to hold on to is precisely their own third world memory. It may well be that the first casualty of becoming a first world country is to let go of your third world memory as an embarrassment, as a badge of shame and indignity. And that anxiety really kind of runs through Irish culture. It's almost like the American immigrants, the Irish Americans who do so well in America and then have to go back to the old world in the way it used to be and try to acclimatise to the Ireland they left behind, and the kind of strange anxiety about the gap in standards of living. Or indeed, some people argue that a lot of Irish people's own anxieties about travellers, so-called thinkers in Ireland, is that to see an image of their own past in the travellers, that kind of destitution and that kind of poverty, and that people don't like to be reminded of what they think they have put behind them. So this thing about memory just springing into existence certainly is not the case. For all the recent success of the Irish economy, as late as the late 1970s, the OECD, the International Economic Development Organization, was still classifying Ireland as underdeveloped and third world. So when I'm saying third world, I'm not talking about post-famine Ireland. I'm talking about Ireland in the 1970s. And the persistence of the northern conflict was a reminder that Irish people still had to awake from the nightmare of history, which is the phrase James Joyce uses in Ulysses. That for those who thought the past was over and done with, the nightmare of history was still prevalent in Ireland right up to the 1990s. So in view of the painful, as it were, prehistory of the Celtic Tiger, it is perhaps no wonder that Ireland's memories of underdevelopment do not come easily, and may be as foreign to contemporary Irish culture as the strangers on its shores. And one of my arguments is that actually the Irish past is almost as foreign to young people growing up in Ireland today as are the strangers coming in waves from Europe and elsewhere. That the past, I think it's L.P. Hartley, the novelist, said, the past is a foreign country. To do things differently there. And the danger in contemporary Ireland is that we might turn our own past into a foreign country if we're not alert to what can happen. I would argue that this engagement with the past is not only vital for Irish people themselves, but actually may be of extraordinary benefit in turning acclimatisation, the adaptation by immigrants to host culture, into a dynamic cultural dialogue. And again, this is a much wider issue, but there should be a difference between an immigrant coming to a country like France or Germany or Britain, where the tie is usually belonging to an old empire. And there's always this history of condescension and whatever, albeit with certain muted obligations, admittedly. But there should be a difference between someone coming from Nigeria to Britain and from Nigeria to Ireland. because Ireland doesn't have that imperial history. And there should be a difference. But the problem is, how do Irish people address that? And funnily enough, Nigeria is one of the cases in point. And I'm going to highlight here a remarkable performance that's taking place here on the campus next Wednesday, which is a production of an Irish play called The Kings of the Kilburn High Road, which is a classic play about the destitution of the Irish in London. The forgotten Irish, as they're often called. And indeed, you get this kind of slight stress and tension between the Irish in London and the Irish in the United States. One, an alleged success story. The other, actually not so successful. And the Irish story in Britain is not at all the same upbeat story as the Irish in America. And this is a play, a pretty unflinching kind of play about the grim realities of the Irish in London in the 1990s, not just in 18th or 19th century. But the play was produced by a Nigerian dramatist and director called Bisi Adigun, a remarkable figure. And what he did with the play was he cast the Irish roles. He cast African actors in the Irish roles. And he changed very little of the script. But if you came into that play and saw it being enacted on the stage without knowing any better, you would have never would have crossed your mind that it wasn't about Africans in contemporary Ireland today. Because everything that happens to the immigrants in the play is happening to African and East European immigrants in Ireland. Except the irony is they're actually playing Irish labourers in London. And for Irish people to look at this play is almost a kind of a double take. There's almost an anxiety watching yourself through the eyes of others. It's almost as if you're looking through a two-way mirror, seeing both yourself and the other in the same darkened glass. And it's an extraordinary that casting alone can throw into relief something that is just barely beneath the surface. So the Keogh Institute has been very lucky to get this whole production to come out to the campus here next week. And I'll say more about Bisi Adigun, the Nigerian, in a moment, because he is one of the live wires and one of these dynamic, when I say there's a dynamic influence, this kind of Nigerian input into contemporary Irish culture is remarkable. So I would strongly advise anybody who has any connection with anybody else to try and get to that production. Even the casting of it is a tour de force. And that is what I mean by saying it's a two-way dialogue. That for a Nigerian to come to Ireland, he can almost cast a play about his own culture by just being true to the realities of contemporary Ireland. And that's what I mean by saying the host culture has a lot to learn. And indeed, the immigrant culture should feel that by learning about Ireland, it's learning about itself in a different way than maybe other cultures. So having said that about the dynamic nature of the relationship, it's not all sweetness and light. And this is what I want to kind of highlight. And I suppose it does link into what we said about the Irish in London. In a cover article called Different to Paradise, the Polish edition of Newsweek in September 2005 highlighted the disillusionment and depression of Polish immigrants in the most mordant detail. And this came as a shock to Ireland, this article in the East European edition of Newsweek. It said, Ireland was supposed to be a promised land for the Poles. It has become a hell on earth for many. And if you can put up the first image, I'll just show you some images to bring you through, if we can get rid of the light. This is an article in the Irish Times recording this. What's remarkable is the Poles are in St. Michael's Church in Dublin. That church was empty virtually until the year 2001, 2002. And now 1,000 attend. 1,000 of a congregation attend every week. But 90% of them are Poles. And one of the extraordinary things is the revitalisation of the Catholic Church through this influx from Eastern Europe of Poles who were almost like the way Ireland itself was in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And that's the edition of the Polish edition of Newsweek. But it makes grim reading for the double take about the Irish and their own history. Much of the disillusionment of the Poles in Ireland is due to the gap that has opened up between the images of the success story in Ireland promulgated by the Celtic Tiger, of which there is no hint of kind of drawing attention to, the success story of the Celtic Tiger. But the gap between that and the lived experience of Ireland for immigrants who come into the country, that is the crisis that is opening up in contemporary Ireland. It's almost as if the Poles coming to Ireland have seen the quiet man and they think it's real. And they come to Ireland thinking they're coming. John Wayne says in The Quiet Man, I want to get back to Innisfree, another name for heaven. And then he calls Pittsburgh so hot a man forgets his fear of hell. So he leaves, sorry, with all due respect to Pittsburgh people, that there's a passage from heaven to hell, or hell to heaven. And that's what The Quiet Man kind of trades on. But here you have it in reverse. Ireland, purportedly a heaven, turns out to be this dark night of the soul for benighted immigrants. The article describes the experience of people with, quote, ambition and delicate character, who are hurt by the Irish reality, who become, quote, depressed, schizophrenic, alcoholic, steal, or try to commit suicide, end of quote. The Polish priest at Mass in St. Michael's Church, this is the church, where 1,000 Poles fill the congregation every Sunday, advised those who were feeling the harsher blasts of the economic climate to, quote, go back home to your families. It's not worth dying for the money in Ireland. End of quote. Every day, buses line up along the quays in Dublin, especially at the weekend, for the direct 48-hour journey to Warsaw, the cheapest mode of transit for those taking the priest's advice. We'll go on to the next image. Once upon a time it was go west, young man in America. Then go west for the Irish. But then you have go west, young Latvians. Up to 100,000 Latvians have gone west in search of work. This has led to a crisis in Lithuania and Latvia, this kind of brain drain and this labour drain in these countries, not to mention Poland itself. So it's almost a double take for Irish people to see what's happening. I mean, 50 years ago, a book was written in Ireland called The Vanishing Irish. And it was no exaggeration. 50,000 were leaving Ireland every year. I mean, when the workforce was 1 million and 50,000 are leaving every year, that's 250,000 gone in 5 years. And The Vanishing Irish was kind of, admittedly, inflated diction, but it was trying to get at a point, at the chronic crisis that was confronting Ireland in those periods. And indeed, some people who were probably in the audience are either products of that Ireland or have relatives who are a product of that Ireland. But now we see the shoe on the other foot, transferring to Eastern Europe. If you can get the next image. But this is what I'm going to try and shift to, just how pervasive the immigrant experience has become in Ireland. This is my local paper. I'm from County Roscommon. We're called affectionately the sheep stealers, the Roscommon sheep stealers. So we wear our badge of honour proudly. Actually, from the Mayo people are called the God help us. Mayo. As soon as you say the word Mayo, people say, oh, God help us. So Roscommon people are at the bottom of the evolutionary tree. But Ballygar is on the border of Galway and Roscommon. And it's a town. So all local papers have these notes of the small towns, everything that goes on, every bit of gossip that goes on in the town. But Ballygar was famous once for having 400 people and 23 pubs. The highest rate of kind of per capita, as it were, in Ireland. And this is what I think this kind of piece of I cut out this at random from the local paper. It just captures, you begin to see, talk on medieval Ballygar. That's par for the course. These little towns are steeped in history. And indeed, not just recent history, but medieval history. So you see medieval, then you see ladies' football. That would not have been there 20 years ago. But it is there now. The next thing you see, media training. The people in Ballygar want to be able to present themselves to the mass media, which again is a totally different Ireland. But then you see crafts classes. Well, that would be there 40 years ago. The next one, Polish classes for Poles in Ballygar. And that is the outreach to the Polish community. And indeed, probably, I noticed the recent one has English classes for Poles as well. But that kind of interface between English classes. And then the one at the very bottom, which is so poignant in its own way, Celtic Tiger. I'll just read, if I can, what's on it. The piles of unwanted clothes, which are collected in Ballygar up on a regular basis by various churches, are an indication of the great times we live in. At this time of year, in the good old days, the Christmas parcel from America was very much looked forward to and appreciated. It's now our time to give that parcel back to others, more or less. And that small little throwaway thing says, just think of how much the parcel from America was looked forward to in Ballygar. Now the shoe is on the other foot. I think we need to give that parcel back to others. And I think that small thing, and that's just a random collection of just how complicated rural Ireland, let alone urban Ireland, has become. And it's that final thing is that now that we're having it so good, again, I think there might even be a danger of complacency in Ireland that we're having it so good. Not least, and this is the final image, from Newsweek magazine, which says there's a crisis in Irish art. Because now that the Irish are happy, what are they going to write about? You know, what's Frank McCourt going to do? Someone said Walt Disney will hire McCourt for an upbeat story about Ireland. But I mean, this article is bizarre. I mean, it's saying that the Irish are now happy, and I'm afraid literature is going to be the first casualty. And I remember the wonderful Irish novelist John McGahern, the most revered and esteemed writer of our generation, who was out here on the campus actually 2 or 3 years ago. McGahern was asked, did he believe in heaven? And he said, I'm not sure about that, but I know one thing about it. And he was asked, what? He says, there are no writers there. And he says, how do you know that? He says, because everyone is happy. He said, sure, how could there be any writers there when everyone is happy, stringing harps all day? You know. So I think in a way McGahern, and that it was said about Yeats, mad Ireland hurts you into poetry. That Ireland hurts people into poetry. And that now that the good times are here, what's going to happen with literature? And that's what I mean by saying the crisis in self-images of Ireland. How are we going to have a Celtic Tiger equivalent to the Celtic Twilight, when in fact we never had it so good? And I think there is a kind of a crisis in contemporary culture, and that's what I'm going to close on, and just to bring the talk to a close in relation to this. So thanks for those images. If you can just turn up the lights a small bit. So going back to the story of the Poles, if there is a strange familiarity in the stories of dejection and melancholia, it is because these stories are reminders of experiences within living memory of Irish people themselves. From precisely the Ireland known previously as the basket case of Europe, or the poorest country in the European Union. As Philip Watt, one of the people coming out for the conference we're having on race and immigration in contemporary Ireland, starting tomorrow and on until next Wednesday. Philip Watt is the head of the National Consultative Committee on Racism and Interculturalism. And this is a quotation from him. He says, Polish and other migrants from the 10 European Union, East European states, are experiencing the same problems young Irish migrants to Britain and the US experienced as late as the 1980s. There's a very vulnerable minority, particularly among young women and young single men. And it's almost as if we're seeing action replay of our own past. And it's in this sense then that I think that not just medieval history, but recent Irish history is a reservoir or a kind of a wellspring for Irish people trying to connect with what's going on in Ireland today. More than any public figure, Mary McAleese, the current president, has given voice to what has come to be known, and there's a name for this kind of argument that I'm trying to develop, and it has come to be known as the historical duty argument. This was given its most succinct formulation in President McAleese's Changing Face of Ireland address, given in London last March, last St. Patrick's Day. And I'll just give you the quotation. Says President McAleese, "The Irish know better than many other races how valuable the immigrants to our shores are. We know these things because of our own extensive history of being immigrants. Of all people on the planet, we have no excuse for getting it wrong. And a lot of work is going into trying to get it right. What is perhaps unique to the Irish situation now is the speed and scale of the change, for we have absorbed in 1 decade what many other so-called countries of immigration have absorbed over many decades, if not centuries." And she goes on, and she is the most probably prominent proponent of what's called the historical duty argument. Such pronouncements acquired a new relevance, obviously, in the age of the Celtic Tiger. But related sentiments were also part of President Mary Robinson's attempts in the early 1990s, before the Celtic Tiger, to link a historical awareness of the Irish diaspora and famine to human rights and developmental issues in the Third World. And Mary Robinson really has to be praised and given the credit for trying to raise awareness among Irish people of the disasters taking place in Somalia and Ethiopia and the Sudan, by saying, you have this in your own past, and you are the people who should reach out. And indeed, Ireland has, and we'll talk about, this is going to be part of the conference taking place here the next few days, Ireland has been to the fore, but I would argue it needs to be much more to the fore in trying to promote this kind of awareness, but in our own name. There's another phrase for this, and I'm using it from an Israeli philosopher, Avishai Margolit. He calls it an ethics of memory. And I would argue that there's a kind of an ethics of memory at work here, whereby the desire to redress injustice or espouse a humane, culturally sensitive response to the plight of others emerges out of a lived engagement with one's own past. An ethics of memory raises the question of whether there are obligations on communities to remember those who've gone before, particularly the casualties of injustice and inhumanity, or those who have given up their lives for the betterment of future generations. He raised the problem. Maybe there's an obligation to remember. Forgetting isn't good enough for certain people. There is an obligation to remember. And we hollow ourselves out if we don't remember. As someone said, to die is one thing, but to be forgotten is to die again, especially if you've died in a noble cause. And that is what Margolit and others are trying to think about in the current conjuncture. It may even be the case that certain kinds of forgetting, or a refusal to draw analogies between past and present, perpetuate the original injustices. Some kind of forgetting may actually perpetuate the original injustices. Who now remembers the Armenians? Hitler is supposed to have said, before he embarked on his own mission to liquidate even the memory of the Jews. And Hitler said, my best kind of cue is that nobody remembers the genocide of the Armenians. That means I'll get away with it as well. And that is in that context that forgetting becomes an accomplice in these acts of devastation. The problem is, though, can memory be converted into what James Joyce called moral history, giving Ireland a unique opportunity to learn from its own past in response to its immigrants today. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, the role of cultural memory was transformed in Western culture, so that memory becomes no longer simply a matter of recall or setting the record straight, which is what most people think of as memory. But it becomes a moral witness. a matter of, and this is the phrase that probably goes at the heart of it, a matter of doing justice to the past. The past isn't just about truth, it's about justice. Remembrance is one of the few consolations left for those excised from history. And it's in this sense that forgetfulness, whether willful or not, can become part of the original crime. Indeed, as studies of trauma show, it may even be a symptom of it. It's kind of striking that in trauma, forgetfulness is a symptom of the original trauma, of the original violation. The recasting of memory as a moral force in its own right derived from the primal injunction after the Holocaust, never again. This was not only a remembrance for the sake of the past, but for the sake of the future. So when people say never again is this going to happen, we owe it to these people to remember them. And not just to have museums, to have it as a recipe for action in the present. And I'm saying that that should be the kind of framework within Irish people, how they relate to their own past. It's against this backdrop, then, I'm going to finish on this, that we should view the charge, often levelled in debates on race and immigration in Ireland, that the historical experience of oppression can actually blind a community to the suffering of others, whether past or present. And there's a whole debate in Ireland that the Irish are so self-absorbed that they never think of others. The first monograph on refugees and asylum seekers, written by Paul Cullen, started with this. Immigration scarred our history, but it also fortified our sense of grievance and victimhood, allowing us to forget that so many other peoples have suffered the yoke of colonial oppression and have had terrible experiences in their own histories. That you can be so licking your own wounds and full of your own importance that you can blind yourself to the suffering of others. That really has to be said. The only problem with some of these analyses is that they take it as inevitable, that that's all the Irish are capable of doing, is thinking not just Sinn Féin, but May Féin, just me, and that the Irish only think of themselves and only think of their own oppression and never think of others. And it's that which I'm trying to counter. And some people even say that the Irish, unfortunately, have this kind of tram tracks approach, that only think of themselves. And people even use the phrase Sinn Féin, which is the name of the political party. And they mistranslate it as ourselves alone, as if the Irish only think of themselves. And as if because you are suffering or because you have this past, it should be put in quarantine because all it makes Irish people think of is themselves. And I'm arguing that that is not true. It doesn't follow that because you have a sense of grievance in the past or because you come out from under the shadow of disaster. It doesn't follow that you cannot think of others. But some people actually have problems with that, to say, no, all you think of. Irish people should stop talking about the famine. They should stop talking about oppression. They should get on with it. And because this actually makes them self-absorbed. And as a kind of counterexample to this, and this is before I end up, I would just ask you to think about a remarkable book that came out just a few months ago, in fact, just published in America recently, called Bad Faith. A study of anti-Semitism in Vichy France, Nazi France, in which Carmen Khalil, the author, relates how a personal crisis leading to an attempted suicide on her part in her 20s brought her into contact with a remarkable therapist in London called Anne Darker, whose profound capacity for empathy and understanding over 7 years helped her to make a recovery with almost a pathological suicidal drive. And luckily she was recommended to this woman. And this woman saved her, she said, from her own self-destruction. In 1970, this came to an abrupt and tragic end when, arriving for an appointment, Khalil discovered that Anne Darker was dead upstairs, having taken her own life during the night. And imagine the shock of trying to recover from suicide yourself, to find out that your own therapist had committed suicide. Researching, and out of sheer trauma herself over this event, Khalil discovered that Darker's father, Louis Darker, was the Eichmann of the Vichy regime, responsible for deporting tens of thousands of French Jews to the camps. The most sinister and truly evil person to be produced by Vichy France. His abandoned daughter was severely damaged by the anguish of this childhood. But instead of relapsing into self-absorption, she dedicated her life to ensuring that such cruelty and callousness would never be visited upon others. And it's a remarkable testimony to how she dealt with this wound, that instead of just thinking of me, she decided others would not have to go through this. In Callil's own words, quote, Anne's greatest suffering came from the silence in which she lived, suffering which she could only ease by contemplating and relieving the pain of others. And she goes on, and I think this is moving. When others talk about Anne's particular skills as a therapist, they always mention her singular empathy. This was her great gift, something that came from her own experience of pain. There was a sense of instant comprehension from her, which made it particularly easy for a foreigner such as me, coming from Australia, to talk to her. It is, end of quote, it is as if darker struggle with her own estranged past provided her with the deep emotional resources to address the stranger, the client, the foreigner in the present. Notwithstanding the unrequited nature of her own grief, which must have been endless, there is nothing counterintuitive about a wounded healer, which is the phrase that Callil uses, finding it within themselves to help others work through the same ordeals. In fact, it may even be an advantage that sympathy is grounded in a personal or cultural past, not just an abstract or intellectual grasp of the issues, making due allowance, of course, for the differences in circumstances. For this reason, I would argue that it is not a sense of history, but in fact a sundering of the past that poses the greatest threat to a multi-ethnic Ireland. So I suppose I'm arguing against those who say the Irish past is a kind of a nightmare and is a force for destructiveness, and Irish people should put all that behind them. I'm arguing it's the other way around. It's a sundering of the past that poses the problems, not a disconnect from it, or not too much of the past. Such are the lasting Twilight achievements of the Celtic revival, the so-called Celtic Twilight, that they provide a vital connective tissue to the past that Ireland loses to its detriment today. And I think one of the remarkable things about the Celtic Twilight, about the energies released 100 years ago, is that it's almost as if they're only coming home to Ireland now, even though they happened 100 years ago, that kind of energy. And I would argue that the Irish studies, the kind of growth of Irish studies, not only at Notre Dame, which is, with BC, the two flagship programmes. Admittedly, they're going to fight it out this afternoon. We'll see who's the flagship programme for Irish studies after that. So, enough said. But in a sense, it could be argued that one of the roles of Irish studies in America is precisely to stop or to prevent Irish America losing its connective tissue to the past in the way that I'm talking about. And it's almost as if when the memory begins to pass from one generation to another, it's almost as if without the archive and without academic programs and without this reactivation, there is a real danger of it just becoming a kind of tourism or a kind of topsoil connection to the past rather than the deep bedrock that comes from an engagement with the culture. But the Irish experience is not just importance for Irish America or the Irish themselves, but also for showing other cultures a way forward, in helping them to reclaim their voices in a genuinely diverse and multi-ethnic public sphere. And one of the most rewarding aspects of teaching on the graduate programme at Notre Dame for me here, and I'm director of the graduate programme in Irish Studies, I'd say half the students come from other ethnic, I'd say only probably a third, if that, come from Irish background. A lot of the students get minorities, or come from minority backgrounds, and get minority fellowships, usually Hispanic, because they can see that Ireland did something that they hope their culture can do, that is, find its voice. And the Irish Renaissance has become a kind of flagship for other Renaissances, not least the Harlem Renaissance. And indeed, the kind of efflorescence of African American writing that took place in New York in the 1920s directly owed its credentials to the Irish Renaissance. If the Irish have done this, we can do it too. Other cultures can do it. And in that sense, Irish studies is not just about me and me only, or Irish and Irish only. It has, again, this general thrust that Irish people should acknowledge and develop. If the literary revival, the Celtic Twilight of Yeats and Synge O'Casey, or for that matter, the literary modernism of Joyce and Beckett and others, has a legacy that extends beyond Ireland, it is that peripheral or minority or marginal cultures can always come in from the cold, finding not only their voices, but speaking them elsewhere on the world stage. In Synge's famous Playboy of the Western World, the masterpiece of the literary revival, premiered exactly 100 years ago at the Abbey Theatre in Ireland. A timorous, inarticulate outsider, and they don't come more timorous than Christy Mahan in the Playboy. I think wimp would be the word that would be used in America, comes in from the cold in the west of Ireland and finds both his voice and popular acceptance in the new community. He becomes a hero. He cannot believe it. One of the biggest hits at the current Dublin Theatre Festival, playing right now, is a rewriting of Synge's play by the Nigerian playwright I mentioned earlier, Bisi Adigun, and Roddy Doyle, in which the playboy is recast as a Nigerian refugee in Dublin. So it's not Christy Mahan coming in from County Clare or wherever. It's a Nigerian refugee finding himself in Dublin. At the end of the play, and the play has to be seen to be believed, as someone says, actually the ad says, you have to see the playboy, it's a riot. Going back, alluding to the fact that the original playboy gave rise to tumultuous riots in the audience because of its subject matter. At the end of the play, the local community is brought to its senses through an encounter with the outsider. But the immigrant's relationship to his own Nigerian background is also restored with a sense of purpose and independence. Whereas the original drama turned on the relationship between the individual and community. Christy is an individual and then there's the community. The new version turns on the interaction of two disparate communities. It would be lovely to think that this staging of the Playboy in Ireland right now by Bisi Adigun, who's coming out to the campus next week, provided a dress rehearsal of a future multi-ethnic Ireland, opening up the curtain on a Western world renewed through its contact with other wider worlds. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Mark.
Yes. Could you tell us, thank you so much, could you tell us what form the prejudice toward the newcomers in Ireland takes? Is it social isolation, segregation, exploitation? Is it ridicule?
It's
where it comes from.
Yeah, kind of layered issue. But one of the arguments that's made about the nature of the new immigration is that Irish people treat immigrants as kind of what in Germany is called guest workers. They see them as purely here for economic reasons. And they're almost kind of an economic throughput. So there's no cultural connection and there's no kind of texture of relationship other than purely instrumental economic. And I think and that is where the immigrant population are at one remove from their community. And that goes back to the Newsweek article. So it's not even that Irish people, it's not even necessarily racism in the capital letter sense. It's the fact that Irish people haven't grasped that the contours of Ireland are changed. These people have a cultures. That's why I said they were foreign nationals, not just non-nationals. They have cultures, just like the Irish who came to America had cultures. And in fact, a Polish school has opened up Polish schools have opened up all over the culture, and the most remarkable one was in Balbriggan in Dublin. As of 2 weeks ago, a school opened up almost entirely of African children. And the townspeople in Balbriggan raised eyebrows, as we say, about this. They weren't welcoming. But when the pupils went to the school, there's a Gaelic Irish language school beside it. And all over the school in Irish was welcome. Welcome, kind strangers. From the Irish language people. They were welcoming them. Whatever about, dare I say it, the Pharisees in the town who were trying to wash their hands. So I think it's a very tricky issue about how Irish people are going to connect with this. We need to do a lot of cultural layering. So thanks for that question.
Regarding the question of the ethics of memory and forgetting, what's gone on in the past as an effort, where do you see a certain revival coming in Ireland in terms of turning that around, being able to learn from and go back to the past, and yet somehow or other not repeat what happened when they themselves experienced this kind of racism in other countries? What movements, I mean, you talked about President McAleese and what she said, and obviously she's really putting that out there and so on. But do you see in terms of the Celtic Tiger and what has gone on in the last 10 years that we're getting to, that Ireland is getting to a point that it's moving away from let's forget the past and get on with it, the whole eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow we die type of concept?
Is putting his finger on one of the problems in contemporary Ireland. I mean, history is no longer even the subject on the school curriculum that it was in our time. It's almost as if the delete button is being pressed on history. And part of the reason is the fear that history is opening up old animosities. So when Tony Blair said, we're lifting the hand of history, and no one can commend that enough, that is true. History is a nightmare. But it doesn't follow, going back to what I said about Carmen and Darker, it doesn't follow that the only way of, that revenge is the only answer. Or it doesn't follow that to inflict more of this in the present is the way of dealing with it. And so it actually is an argument that there's not just one past, there are multiple pasts. In fact, who was it said, the past is not over, it's not even past. Someone said, I think it was William Faulkner said that, the past is not. So I would say that in a sense, one of the big issues facing the younger generation, I'm talking about our kids, is how we can get them to reconnect with the history in which they might actually see the face of the other. But ironically, Irish people are, as I say, are estranged from their own past. Now, some people say the heritage industry will do it. I'm not so confident. I mean, some people say the heritage, museums, if they're well designed, like the Family Museum in Strokestown, is designed with a whole section of the Third World and developing countries and the Sudan. That's the way museums should be. They should be quarantining, putting the past in mothballs. They should be seeing the past as a moral resource for the present. And Irish Studies, of course, is the same. And that's why we're hosting this conference on race and immigration.
We can have one last question.
Two.
Sir, please. Yes, make it short.
Culture, this is a very dramatic example of an issue that I'm wondering is also pretty much archetypal, where the oppressed become the oppressors. I'm third generation Irish, grew up in Cleveland in an Irish ghetto, and there was a terrible prejudice against the blacks at that time. That's just a small thing. So I'm saying perhaps it's telescoped and so dramatic, but that this is a universal experience of the oppressed.
No, that's an important point. And again, I hope people, if they're able to come to the conference, there'll be a lot of talk about that. And in the longer version of the paper, I kind of deal with that. I mean, how then the Irish, who know what it's like, how then they dish it out to others. And that, as I said, that's part of the argument taking place in Ireland today. Just the one caveat I would say about that, and this is controversial to say this, I would say that Irish people who do that are dancing on the graves of their own parents and grandparents. That is a dysfunction. I mean, that doesn't stop it from happening. I'm not saying that hasn't happened. But Irish people, there's a phrase I don't like, but there's something in it called self-hatred. Irish people who do that to others are doing it to themselves. Now, that doesn't stop it from happening, but it's part of the self-destructiveness in the culture as well, and there's a lot of interest in the social psychology of racism. What are the precipitates that give rise to this kind of attitude towards others, particularly when you don't come into the world with habits of authority, when you've just come up from the bottom rung of the ladder yourself. So I take your point. It's a very complicated issue about how the underdog becomes, as soon as they get a foot on the ladder, they step on those. And the gangs of New York is a case in point. the movie, which glossed over the Irish draft riots, where the Irish slaughtered African Americans in New York, meanwhile having their rows with the WASPs. And the film kind of glossed over the draft riots, which is one of the darkest chapters in Irish American history. But I think rather than shying away from it, that's why I'm glad you brought it up, that really does need to be looked at. How can people who've gone through this inflict it on others? And I would argue it is a kind of dysfunction or a disconnect in their own past. There is some kind of... they often do it in the name of their past, but ironically, it's disfigurant. So I take a point, that really needs to be said.
I have to draw this to a conclusion. If you're interested in this topic, obviously many of you are, there are still a few tickets, I don't know how many, left for Mary Robinson's address in Washington Hall tomorrow evening. You can go to Washington Hall and get those tickets.
Tickets are free.
Okay, all right, so you just need a ticket to get in. Won't cost you anything. And the play, The Kings of Kilburn High Road, will be performed in Barlow Performing Arts Center on Tuesday evening and on Wednesday evening, and there are still tickets available for that play, just to let you know. The last thing I'll say is that we have a very unusual relationship with Professor Gibbons, that is, the university does. He actually teaches in the fall in the International Irish Studies program, which is part of the Newman House in Dublin. And so he flew in, he and his wife got in last night, I think, about 11:30. And Dolores, would you also stand? We're very grateful that they came back. Please, right here. So, thank you all for coming.
So thank you for giving up valuable drinking time. I hope we gave a drink for thought, not food for thought.